Hi everyone, I'm Crystal, and today I'm going to show you how I made this 3D ocean painting using a flat canvas. So I'll start by talking about the materials that I used for the project, and then I'll show you my process and how I built this sculpture over a flat surface. Okay, so these are the materials that I'll be using to create the base of the artwork. So first I have a regular 8x10 canvas that I painted over to reuse. I have this flexible mesh wire, and I have some plaster cloth that I will lay over the mesh wire. And for the mix I have plaster, of course, this wall joint compound that I don't really think that I actually needed, but I'll get more into that later. And then for the mix I also have some white glue, and later on I also added some white paint. So to create the base, I have my canvas and I'm starting by layering the wire mesh over the canvas and using a staple gun to staple it to the back of the canvas. So while I'm doing this, I'm using a little bit of extra wire mesh so I can create waves in the base to create texture. So I'm just going around the canvas with the wire mesh, making sure that the whole surface is covered in wire mesh, leaving room to create texture, to create the waves, and then just securing it to the back of the canvas with my staple gun. I'm cutting off any excess wire mesh that I don't need. And then I'm using my paintbrush here to kind of go underneath the mesh and pinch the paintbrush just to get those waves a little bit more defined and to have a bit more variation in the texture. This is what the mesh is looking like now. You can see the waves in the base that I've created. And now I'm getting my plaster cloth. I am cutting it into pieces, dipping the pieces in water, and then laying the cloth over the wire mesh. So it is a bit easier to work in pieces instead of having one long strand, but whatever works for you. So I dip the piece of cloth into the water, I lay it over the mesh, and then I'm taking a wet paintbrush and just going over the edges, making sure that they're completely wet, making sure that they're smoothed out, and making sure that every surface in every section of the wire mesh is completely covered. So I'm kind of overlapping the cloth to make sure that there's no spaces where the mesh can show. And here I'm just making sure to get the edges of the canvas as well, so that way that no matter what angle you're looking at it from, it kind of has an even texture from all sides and from all over the canvas. So just making sure to cover the edges with my plaster cloth as well, getting my wet paintbrush and just wetting the edges, making sure that they're secure, covering all the corners here. And I'm now taking my paintbrush and making sure that I'm really getting into the dips and the lower sections there, so that way there's as much contrast as possible between the high points and the lower points of the sculpture. So this is what the artwork looks like so far. It's completely covered in plaster cloth. I've made sure there's no mesh showing. I've gotten all the edges and the corners, and now this is what it looks like after it's dried for about 12 hours. The cloth is completely dried and hardened, and so now we're ready to start making the plaster mix and applying it over this base. So to make the mix, I'm getting my plaster and the drywall compound to start. I have some water in that Tupperware already, and I'll just start by adding some plaster mix and mixing it into the water. So the tutorial I watched, she didn't measure anything, so I'm also just eyeballing it and just adding ingredients until it kind of gets to a consistency that I like. So I'm little by little adding more and more plaster to the water. Here I'm adding some white glue, and I've also added some of the wall joint compound. And I think if I were to do this again, I might actually skip the wall joint compound. In the tutorial I watched, she used spackle, and so I thought that this would be like a similar ingredient, but I ordered it offline, and as you can see, it's like really thick and it was hard to get out of the tube, and I don't actually think that it was the same as what she used. But I mean, I tried it anyway. I'm not sure it made much of a difference, honestly, so I think next time I would just skip it, but I did use it for this mix. So I'm still just adding plaster little by little, white glue, mixing it up, and then deciding if I want it to be a little thicker or what. So it took a little while to get the consistency to a place that I liked, but just adding ingredients little by little helped me to get there to a nice, smooth, thick texture. So I decided to add clay into the mix. I wasn't originally going to do that, but since the wall joint compound was kind of weird, I thought maybe the clay would help just keep everything together and get it to a nice thick consistency. So I've put some clay into the second Tupperware and then added my mix, added my plaster mix to that. This second mix is really thick, so you'll see me add water a few times, and I ended up just mixing it with my hands because it was so thick with the clay in it. So this mix looks nothing like the tutorial that I watched. Hers was like buttery smooth. She could use a paintbrush to apply it. Mine was so thick that I just ended up applying it with my hands. Hey, I got it to work. So we're improvising here. This mix isn't coming out like I thought it would, so I'm just, doing what I can to make it work. So I'm using my gloves and just picking up the plaster and clay mix and applying it over the canvas. My gloves are wet and I'm spraying water here. That helps to just smooth out the texture. And here I'm also using a wet paintbrush once it's fully covered. I'm just going over with a wet paintbrush to try to smooth out any bumps or any chunky parts. The mix was really chunky, so that's not what I had planned for, but we're making it work. So I'm kind of just smoothing it out as best as I can, trying to scrape off the little chunks of clay that I couldn't mix in well, and especially getting into the lower parts of the sculpture again to keep that contrast between the low and the high parts of the waves. So just making sure there's no gunked up mix in the lower parts. And this is how it looks. It dried for about 48 hours, and you can see it's a little bit chunky still, a little bit chunkier than I wanted. So I actually ended up sanding this before I applied the second layer of plaster mix, just because I wanted it to be a little bit smoother, and since it didn't come out that way, I figured the sandpaper could help me achieve that. So this is, you can see the texture and the bumps from the chunky clay. And so I'm just using a softer sandpaper here, and I'm just gonna gently smooth it out as best as I can. It's not perfect, but it works. So this is what it looks like sanded down. You can see it looks a little bit less chunky. And so now I'm going to apply the second layer of plaster mix. So this is what the mix looks like the second day. I sprayed the Tupperware with water before I closed it, and you can see a lot of that moisture is still in the bin, which is good because I didn't want it to dry up. So I started just by mixing in that water a little bit better, and I'm adding white paint today, which I forgot the first day, but I feel like that helped it to be a lot more creamy and smooth. So I would definitely not skip the white paint next time. So you can kind of see the consistency is smooth and creamy, and this is more like what I was going for the first day. So after mixing in the water, mixing in the white paint, I can now go in with my paintbrush and pick up the mix and just paint it on to the base. So I'm just using a wet paintbrush and gently painting over the base just like I did on the first day, except this time my mix is a lot smoother. It's more paintable, if you will. It's got a nicer consistency and is less chunky. There are still a little bit of pieces of clay that I couldn't quite smooth out, but it's a huge improvement from the first day. So just making sure to get every surface, getting the edges and the corners, and making sure it's completely covered. And this is what it looks like after I've let it dry for 24 hours. So I'm going to go in with the sandpaper again just to get it as smooth as possible, and then I'll paint a layer of gesso over it to prepare it for being painted. This is what it looks like after it's been sanded down and has one layer of gesso on it. And now it's ready to be painted. Okay, so I painted the 3D sculpture off camera, and this is how it came out. I made a little ocean themed painting or sculpture from it. I used modeling paste to create these foamy crashing waves at the top, and I'm pretty happy with how it came out. I really like the idea of using the waves of the canvas as ocean waves. So this was a really fun first experiment. I'm still debating whether or not I'll varnish this. I think it would look nice with like a nice glossy finish, but I'm also still wondering if I'll go back in and touch up the water, like just the blues of the water, and just making some more like highlights and shadows. So I hope that you enjoyed watching. Thanks for being here, and stay tuned for more fun art experiments. Bye.